Committee meeting. I'll pass it over to Myra.
Members, Dr. Acevedo, Mr. Bali, Ms. Hernandez, thank you for joining us, and Ms. Saavedra, thank you for being here. My name is Myra Martinez. I'm the Chief Internal Auditor, and we have 3 items on the agenda for the Board Audit Committee The first item on the agenda is going to cover one of the critical processes we have in the Internal Audit Department, and that is the risk assessment and audit plan development processes. Requirements for having an audit plan that is risk-based come from the Institute of Internal Auditors professional standards, as well as from the board's expectations outlined in board policy CFC logo, as well as in our audit charter, which is CFC exhibit. The audit plan is so critical because it establishes the framework for the work that we do in internal audit, because we're confronted with unlimited potential projects that we can perform from our office, but have limited resources. We establish a risk-based plan that's consistent with the district's goals and the strategic priorities to determine the work that we do. So as such, we make sure that our audit plan, as we're developing it, is consistent with the district's goals and priorities. That's based on a documented risk assessment that's performed annually. During this process, we also consider input from management, leadership, the superintendent, and then each individual board member. We also need to ensure that our audit plan is dynamic and flexible so that we can be responsive to changes and unforeseen issues that may come up during the year. Ultimately, the goal is to ensure that internal audit examines areas with the greatest exposure to the key risks that could affect the district's ability to accomplish its goals, its strategic priorities, objectives, etc. This slide provides the first 5 steps in the audit plan methodology, which make up the risk assessment. This is a high-level overview, starting with identifying the district priorities themselves. Now that we have a new board-approved strategic blueprint, this also gives us a good idea of where we're going for the next 3 years. The next 4 steps are to identify the audit universe, review, update risk factors, gather relevant information, and then assess and prioritize risks. And let me go into this in more detail. The second step, which is to identify the audit universe, is where we take the time to review the district's organizational charts, the district's strategic documents, position inventory listing, budget documents, in order for us to get what we call the audit universe, is the key risk areas that could be subject to an audit. These should be sufficiently important that they contribute to the EPISD's goals and priorities, that they can noticeably impact EPISD if something were to go wrong, and that they justify the cost of having controls in place to mitigate those risks. To complete the next step, before we do the risk scoring, we need to identify how we're going to how are we going to assess the risk? And we use these 8 risk factors that we review annually. So this is, again, rolled forward from last year. These are the 3 risk factors we use, the 8 risk factors we use to measure risk in terms of likelihood and impact. So for likelihood, we measure internal control. That is, what are the procedures, the processes that each auditable unit has in place. Changes in the unit, whether it's changes in processes or changes in people. The complexity of monitoring some of the activities that occur at the unit. And then the audit or evaluation history. The risk factors that we use to measure impact include how critical is the unit or the auditable unit to accomplishing the district's priorities. What is the financial impact should something go wrong in that unit? What are the regulatory compliance requirements tied to that unit? And then the last one is public sensitivity. We will be going through these risk factors, and these are presented to you as well in case you have any feedback right now or even after the meeting, so that as I'm going through this process for the year, you have an opportunity to provide input into any changes you think might be necessary. So please, I'm going to continue, but stop me if you'd like to, if you have any comments. Step 4, it's not a slide, but after we determine the risk factors, we've updated these, we develop management questionnaires in order to gather information from various levels of management related to these internal controls. We ask questions such as, what is the mission of your department? What policies and procedures do you have in place? How formal are your procedures? Are they just outlined in policy? Do you have specific procedures at the department level, at the process level? How many changes have occurred in your department? And that includes staffing and budgetary changes. We also go over the complexity, how easy is it to monitor the processes at your department. And then we have information as far as audit, but we also ask if there's been any external audits. I reach out to the superintendent's office as well to see if there's any external audits that possibly we have not gotten a copy of so that we can consider that in our scoring. The criticality of the unit is we tie it back to, again, the district's the district's strategic plan, the strategic blueprint that we have now, the priorities as discussed during board meetings they had attend. We also look at financial information, general ledger information, so that we can look at the budgets for these different departments and the staffing tied to these different departments. And then we ask about the regulatory compliance. And then again, we look at, what's in the news, what's going on with this department. Is there a lot of interest? Do we see that there's a lot of people coming to public forum to talk about these various units or priorities? And that's kind of where we just gather a lot of information, send questionnaires, gather questionnaires, meet with people so that we can compile the information to take us to the next step, which is to actually do the scoring. So each one of the risk factors has a 3-point scale, 1 being the lowest risk to 3 being the highest risk. And I provided an example of the risk factor for financial impact. As you can see, we consider low risk for just that risk factor if the annual budget for that unit is 1%, less than 1% of the district's annual budget. Medium risk if it's between 1 and 5% of the district's annual budget. And then high risk if it's more than 5% of the district's annual budget. And just like we've defined the 3-point scale for the financial impact, we've done it for each one of the 8 risk factors that we use to measure the risk. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I really like the way you did these charts, like the likelihood, the impact. I really like that a lot. I guess my question would be on public sensitivity.
Yes.
Why is that important to consider as a risk and included in as part of this?
Because the public sensitivity leads to also the perception of the public for the district. I know the board talks a lot about our image and how we're perceived by the community, by the public. So that's just been a risk factor that we've included historically. Again, these are the ones that I'm rolling forward from last year at this point. Again, we're open to suggestions if it's something that we want to define a little differently. But that's the reason why historically I've included it as one of the risk factors.
Would information associated with public sensitivity, for example, I use the term transparency quite often.
Yes.
Because many times a perception may be due to lack of transparency. So if nothing else, it informs us as a school district on areas where we might need to communicate more readily, or it may give us information associated with the level of transparency that we need to, engage in with the community on any given initiative, or, because that lack of transparency later on may become a significant risk, for the district.
Absolutely,
Right?
Ms. Abbott.
Okay.
Yes.
Mhm.
Did you have any other feedback on
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
I think that I would just highlight that a little bit more in the sense of, like, I feel like exactly what Messiah just said. It's like a transparency and accountability measure as you're doing this work to mitigate risk or something like that.
Okay. And what I can do is, as I work on the risk factors, this is just the title of each of the risk factors, but within each one and in our final risk assessment document, and as I'm meeting with the board, I've defined those better where I provide examples of what that means. So I'll make sure that I will incorporate some of these comments into that category.
Thank you.
And then just so you know, the scoring itself, I gather all the information. My staff helps gather information at times. I meet with different levels of management, but I do the scoring based on the information gathered. After that scoring is done, I meet with the leadership level administrators to go over the results, where we can still just have a discussion about, if there's this disagreement with the score, we go back and forth until we come to an agreement of what really it could be, what it should be. And again, it's so important that we get this right, because this really drives the work that we do. This makes sure that we're auditing the right areas of the district, and we're following the board's expectations.
Does that flow up to the cabinet level?
Absolutely, yes, ma'am. So once after I meet with, I'll cover this once I communicate, but it's management, and then all the way up, I make it a point to follow up with individuals on questionnaires if I need clarification. But the meetings that I always have are with your cabinet level administrators. I go over the results, I go over the proposed projects, and that's when I really take time to meet with everyone before even coming to you and going to the board. The next step in the process, and the final step related to the risk assessment at least, is to assess and prioritize the risk. As you can see, we have for auditable unit, we have the 8 risk factors, and then the potential scoring. And then this is how I rank the score. If it's a score between 4 and 6.9, it's low risk. 7 to 9.9 is medium risk, and 10 to 12 is high risk. I risk separately the likelihood and the impact score, as you can see the last 3 columns on your right. And that gives us the risk rank, which is, it's either going to be high, medium, or low for likelihood and impact. Any questions?
I have a question, Ms.
Yes,
Martin.
ma'am.
So, I recall that this spreadsheet that you did for us the last time.
Yes.
So, where is it in this process that we'd be getting that after you meet with us?
Yes, so what I'll do is, this is the first step. I've started working already on gathering information, organizational charts, looking at procedures. I still need to update the audit universe, whereas you'll see all this listing, and then send out questionnaires, gather. So it's like very early in the process, but my hope is that I'll start meeting with the board late February, early March, at the latest,
Okay. Thank you.
in order for me to meet my timelines. The next 5 steps in the audit plan methodology after the risk assessment are listed on the slide. One critical piece is also to determine the available resources. So this is where we look at our staffing that we're going to have for next year. We look at the knowledge base that our staff have, that they have the experience, that they have the enough education and to conduct the audits that audits of the areas we've identified as high risk. So it's not just having the staff, but having the staff with the right knowledge. If we don't have the knowledge, can we find the training to provide to our staff so that we can get up to speed to carry out these engagements? That's very important as well. After we match our resources to the potential projects, then we propose and solicit feedback. So this is Ms. Saavedra at the point where we start meeting with cabinet level administrators. Once I meet with all of them, then I'll go to Ms. Saavedra to talk to her about proposed projects, then kind of the results of the risk assessment. I know last year I got to meet with you twice, which was great. Got to go back, do some work, and then come back and bring you some revised options. And also I got to meet with all of the board members one-on-one, which is also really great, where I get to have a discussion about the results and not just consider, high-risk items, but also other areas that you may have that are of concern to you that maybe they didn't come up as high in the risk assessment, but it's things that are coming up as initiatives or priorities for the district that we should consider as well. Once I get that feedback, then I'll finalize the audit plan and communicate it to the board for approval. We typically have an audit committee meeting in April before the regular board meeting, so we can again go over the process that I actually followed, if it changed from here, and then to discuss the results and then the proposed projects for the following year. For this year, since we have a strategic blueprint that goes for about, I think you had said 3 years, so I'm considering doing more of a 3-year proposed schedule. The board has to approve 1 year at a time according to board policy, but I think it'll give us an opportunity to start planning ahead. That could be helpful for making sure that I have the right staff, that I have the right training, and also just to make sure we have coverage. One of the things that, Eva, if you can help me distribute, that I prepared for you all today. I didn't get it in time to submit with the presentation, I apologize, but I prepared this document that provides a listing of of the internal audit reports historically since 2014. And at the top, you'll see that they have, it's by year, by auditable units from last year. I haven't updated the audit universe as I go through this process. But you'll see that A stands for audit, C is consulting, F is for follow-up, and N is a non-audit, meaning could be an investigation. And then an asterisk means that maybe we didn't audit that specific department, but there was a component tested. And this gives you an idea of the various, based on the audit universe and the years, the areas that we covered, whether we've done an audit. In parentheses, you'll see that if we did multiple audits for that area in 1 year. The example that I was giving with the asterisk, number 17 for analytics, strategy, assessment, and PEEMS, even though we haven't necessarily audited that department, there's been components of PEEMS, as you can see, in audits in multiple years. And then for 2023, that was for evaluation services for dual language had a component as well. So I try to include that so you can get an idea of the areas that we've audited or investigated and consulting engagements, and then the areas that we still haven't. And you can see that under academic, school leadership, and IT, those towards the bottom are the ones that we haven't been able to audit, like staff development, social emotional learning, migrant program, health, wellness, education, library learning centers, resources, parent involvement program, is based on priorities. And then you look at some of the administration areas. There's areas that we've audited more frequently than others. We've done this based, again, our audit plans are based on risk, but I thought that this would give you a good idea kind of where we are over the last, like over 10 years. But also that I think this is important that I share with the board as I'm going through this audit plan development process. That way you can see, maybe in the operations areas, we've really focused on facilities and construction, but maybe for the years that follow, we need to go to maintenance, we need to go to transportation, et cetera. But I wanted to give you an idea of the areas we've covered and the areas that we haven't, because maybe next year's plan, we do want to keep risk-based. We also want to maybe include a couple of projects that are rotation. They're on a rotation basis, not just strictly risk-based.
Yeah, I went through and I starred some things that haven't been audited ever.
Yeah, there's definitely, we only have so many resources, and we always get pulled back to a lot of, you'll see that there's departments that come back and we keep doing audits of that, but there's opportunities to include more of these areas in the future. So yeah, that's where I would want our department to go. And of course, this is audit universe based on last year. These are some of the terminology tools old based on last year. I need to update it based on the reorg, on the new priorities. So this may change and include other areas that we haven't audited before.
I have a question,
Yes, ma'am.
and you may have covered it, and it just didn't resonate with me in that way. So when you're conducting an audit, are there levels of audits? I know that the risk factor has levels, but in terms of how comprehensive the audit is, I know sometimes TA calls them desk audits versus, live audits and things like that. So I guess my question is, for some of these that haven't been audited ever, and pose maybe somewhat of a low to medium risk factor, would there be audit capability that maybe is not as comprehensive, but there's some semblance of auditable oversight, if you will?
Yeah, I think there's definitely opportunities for that. I think an example, for example, this year, we're going out to do campus audits again. Typically, those are just under campus active agency funds under campus accounting. What we did this year is we have a piece related to attendance, and we have a small piece related to truancy. So I think as we do some of these audits where we're combining different objectives, we can include that. So if we're looking at, for example, guidance and instruction, maybe we also have a staff development component because we haven't audited staff development. So I think if we can combine our audits that way, where maybe it's not like the big audits that we do where we're looking at an entire process district-wide, but we're looking at a department and we can at least look at the professional development within that department, then at least we've started to look at the process and have touched upon it to see, is it really that low risk, or are we missing things that maybe this does need to be a district-wide audit? so we can try to cover some of it that way. And then there's some areas that I think, for example, like maintenance buildings and grounds is one that we've been putting off for a while. I know TASCO did do an external audit in the past, so we kind of were like, well, they've done a recent audit, they've done some, made some changes in that department, but now that we're winding down with facilities, the bond projects, maybe that would be another big audit we could take on, as well as transportation and custodial operations. So I know it's like a lot of information. I try to combine it as best I could. Of course, if you have ideas on this, how this can look better, I'm always open to suggestions.
This is good
Mhm.
information.
Any questions? Okay, so on the last slide, I just wanted to say that, you know, the high-risk auditable units, you know, they may be included in the audit plan based on input from management, leadership, and the board. But again, we also have to consider auditable units for an audit or a cap that maybe hasn't been conducted in maybe 3 years. Is it something that we follow up on? Risks that were discovered during our audits or investigations. We also consider some of those risks as we're selecting our audits, or areas that are identified by the board, management, or leadership as an area of concern. And once we have all this information, will be submitted. The plan will be submitted to the board for approval in April of 2023. We may submit a schedule again that maybe will give you an idea of like the rotation for the next 3 years, but the board will ultimately be approving the audit plan for next year. And I think this was a duplicate, and that's all I have for this presentation. Are there any questions? Okay. So we'll move on to the next item. The second item on the agenda is our standard internal audit activity report. This activity report covers the period quarter 2, which is the months of October, November, December, and I want to say partially December since I submitted this before the break and before the month was over. You already know the responsibilities that are outlined in policy, but based on these requirements, I prepared this activity report that covers the status of the audit plan, corrective action plan, the status of corrective action plans, the resources for internal audit, as well as the status on hotline reports. The audit plan was initially approved in April of 2022, and adjustments were approved by the board in November of 2022. It covers the period of July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. So we're about halfway done with the year. The plan, we have 20 planned projects in the audit plan, and we have 2 contingency projects that have been added to the plan, which brings the total to 22 projects. As of December, we have completed 36% of the projects through the reporting phase of the 22. We have another 50% of the projects that are in the implementation, they're in progress phase, and that means we haven't completed 14% of the projects, which represents 1 audit and 2 corrective action plans, 3 projects total. For reporting purposes, I've split up the audit plan into two different groups. The first one includes the assurance, which is audits, consulting, and investigation projects. There's 11 of those in the plan. As you can see, the top 3 projects were completed. The report was issued and has been posted online. The report was shared with the board and the superintendent. The projects that are in the reporting phase, the dual language and the bond project closeout audit, are both in the reporting phase. These both reports went out to administration, the draft reports, and to the board and superintendent. The corrective action plan is due this month. If we get that corrective action plan in time, which we hope to, then these 2 reports will be finalized this month as well. The next report is the campus systems audits. These are audits we're going to be doing throughout the year. We conducted 2 in the month of December. We're wrapping up the field work and expect to issue a report during this quarter. And we expect to go out to more schools during this quarter as well and in the final quarter of the year. The transcript, power-up, and payroll audits are on the planning phase. Just like we do a risk assessment for our audit plan, at the engagement level for each audit, we do the same thing. We gather information, we conduct a risk assessment, we send out internal control questionnaires because we want to get it right even at that level, to make sure we're getting the right scope and objectives. To Ms. Saavedra's point, that's where we can identify opportunities to address different sub areas within the audit. So these projects that are in the planning phase, we expect to complete this year. We also started an IT consulting engagement related to the disaster recovery and business continuity plan that I'll discuss more in the slides that follow. And the only audit we haven't started is an ESSER audit that we were expecting to begin this semester, the spring semester. We know that TA is in the process of doing a desk audit. We haven't heard back as far as what they've sampled, what they're requesting. So I was hoping we could hear back from them because I really don't want to duplicate effort and audit the same thing that they are. So right now we're really pushing hard on the transcripts, Power Up, and payroll audit to move those forward until we have further information on the TEA audit. Any questions?
And depending on what they tell you there, could you just then use that desk audit in lieu of this?
Well, what we
Yeah.
hope is that we can look at what their results are, and we can either follow up further on that if it's high risk, and if not, we can look to see what they did and not audit that and do something different, something that we think would be beneficial or something that we think TA may come back and audit during a second round. Yes.
And Ms. Martinez, remind me, on the screen, the second to the last screen that you had there, the reporting period that, can you, right there on the left-hand side, through the reporting phase?
Oh, yes.
So what is the reporting phase?
Yeah, so those are the reports that we've already finished the audit.
Right.
And we've distributed the report, and it's either been published online or we're just pending the corrective action plan.
So what was the time frame for that?
So typically for a corrective action plan, once they've been issued, we give them 2 weeks to respond.
Right.
Dual language, we treat it a little differently because the individuals, when we issued the draft report, the executive director and director hadn't joined the district. So we thought, we know the challenges with corrective action plans. So in order for us to make sure we had the right buy-in and the people that were going to implement the CAP were here, we gave them additional time to develop the CAP. So for that reason, we extended it about maybe three or 4 weeks to make sure that they were here and able to develop the plan. And that's coming due in about a week and a half.
I see. Now I know.
Yes.
I know.
And I did notify the board and the superintendent when that happened. Yes, sir.
For the ESSER audit, I know that you said we're going to wait on the state to see when and what the results say. Do we have a start date? If, say, they don't come forward in the next 3 months and we're still waiting, do we have a start date that we're just going to have to start at some point and not wait on the state?
I think if I don't hear back from them in the next, by early March, then I'll have a conversation with you all to see how we can just move forward with this.
Okay.
I would venture to say because of the amount of money that, they've been pretty vigilant with these, especially with ESSER. So I wouldn't anticipate that they would hold off too long.
I think we got notification in November. Was it October? October. Mhm. And I think we submitted all the documents in November, possibly November. But yes, they gave us some time to submit all the required documents, and then they typically review those, select a sample, and ask for more documentation. I know I checked with the superintendent's office last week, and we hadn't received a follow-up on that from TA yet. And I will definitely keep you all posted on, how we move. At some point, if we need to move forward, we'll come up with the best way to do that based on what they've asked for so far. So this slide provides where we are, percentage completion by project for each of those 11 assurance, consulting, and investigation projects. The next group of projects that that was the first, this is the second, are the corrective action plan follow-up reviews. We also have 11 of these. 2 corrective action plan follow-up reviews have been completed and the report has been issued. The third one, the bond project closeout audit CAP, according to management, the CAP has been implemented. We did some additional work here where we went out to various schools just to see the status of some of the closeout, the punch list items, and they were just pending clarification on one item. but we expect to issue that report this month on the status of this one. Then you'll see the 6 caps that are in the implementation phase, which are those that are open. And then the last 2 are projects that we haven't started. The dual language audit cap, we know we're gonna need a corrective action plan for that. So as soon as we receive that, we'll start monitoring that. We don't know the timelines yet, so we'll just be providing, we'll provide the board a status as based on the timelines that they provide. And then the transcript audit, we usually include it in our plan just because typically audits have a cap, but it's too early to know if there will be one for that project yet. But for now, we have it in our plan as set aside hours to do it. And then this provides a percentage of completion by cap for those that are open. The last 2, although they say 0%, it just means that those due dates for those activities haven't occurred. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're past due. And then before I move on to a report on the status of caps as far as if there's any delays or past due activities, are there any questions regarding the audit plan status portion of the presentation? Now I'll move on, as I don't have to remind you the requirements. The requirements of board policy require that I inform the board of any caps that are delayed or that have required extensions. So, as I mentioned earlier, 6 caps are in the implementation phase. At the time when this report was submitted, we do have 1 cap that an activity that was due in November, contracted services. I'll talk about that in a little more detail. I've spoken to the superintendent about this one already, but I'll provide the board a status. This slide provides the age, meaning how long has the cap been open and how many months management expects for them to be open overall. I can tell you that 3 of these caps will be extended. So the one for 22.05, 22.07, and 22.13, even though those months are pretty close, we've received requests for extensions on those 3. And then this slide provides the status of the activities within each cap. The blue indicates that those activities have been closed, and the yellow are the activities that remain open for each of the caps. At the time when I submitted this, only 1 cap had a past due activity, but now there's 3 of them that we will be discussing. And then these are the due dates for the open activities, upcoming due dates. The ones in yellow are those that were due between 1 to 30 days. The gray are due in 31 to 60 days. The blue, 61 to 90, and then the dark blue are 90 days or plus that are due. And then the 3 cap activities for which we'll need extensions are these on this slide. The first one is on the data center consulting cap. I think I've been communicating to the board about this one. It was initially due last summer in June. We extended it. However, there wasn't anyone in the leadership position. It was initially extended to December. Once Mr. Verduzco joined the team, we had a conversation about how to move that activity forward. I brought back the audit plan to the board so we can add a consulting engagement so internal audit can work with IT on closing out this activity. Not only are we in the extension, was the extension requested, but also the scope of the activity itself is changing a bit. We're really focusing on IT-related disaster recovery plan for the data center for critical systems. Because if you think about disaster recovery district-wide, that could include even at the level in a classroom for a teacher to take attendance. If our system goes down, how do teachers take attendance? Do we have the right processes in place and paper to make sure that they can take attendance and we don't miss out on having accurate data for that day? So for this purpose, for the data center, since it really was focused on IT, the activity will focus on that, on the data center and critical systems that are kept in the data center or by our IT department. Mr. Verduzco is here too, also in case the board has any questions regarding the extension for this activity. It's the new due date will be June 30th, 2023. Yes, sir.
I just want to be sure, so we're sure that this 6-month extension is sufficient enough that we can close out this cap? Because this is what extension on this specific one?
This is the 3rd extension.
The 3rd, so are we sure that that June deadline is going to be the last one, hopefully?
As we're going through the process, just to make sure it was reasonable, but I'll let him.
So So before he goes on, I would say that I think it's the third extension, but it's the first extension request during Mr. Verduzco's tenure. The other two were from, previous administration. So in that transition, I think rightly so, for him to get a good handle on what he's dealing with and what is going to be required to meet the demand of the cap. It's a safe assumption that a 6-month extension is probably at the minimum what he might need to do this well, but I'll let you answer that.
And that was really my question is, are we sure we don't need 9 months or something? I know you're coming in new to that position, and then I know there's additional portfolio that you'll be acquiring as well. So I want to ensure that if it's a 9-month extension that we're looking at, or a year, I'd rather have that conversation on the front end than piecemeal it like we kind of have been, and granted, knowing it's under new leadership.
Good evening. Upon my tenure, one of the things that on this cap that I review is that it was a business continuity plan, which normally involves multi-departments across the board. Where what we wanted to do is narrow the focus to information and technology systems, and especially address the mission critical systems that really apply to the technology department. Otherwise, the plan will, as a business continuity, would be more expand to include other departments.
And that's kind of why we changed the scope of the activity itself to really focus on that. Because when we had the conversation, he thought, okay, that's reasonable. But if it's a district-wide one, then that's not realistic to do. So, and again, we also set aside some consulting hours so that our IT auditor, Tony Alanis, is here. He's also going to be working with Mr. Verduzco to help him try to move this forward. I think as we're going through the process, if we can quickly see that it's not realistic, then I'll definitely have that conversation with the superintendent, with Dr. Carmona, and with the board to see if there's any challenges that we need to deal with. But at this point, I know we went back and forth on this one, and I had asked Mr. Verduzco if he felt comfortable with June, and it came down to, focusing on IT.
Well, I think that that's wise, and that's why it's the 6-month extension, because I think what I heard you say, Mr. Verduzco, it's on the mission critical things that I think that the board was fairly concerned about, specifically more so than the business continuity piece. So.
The next cap that has delays is on the cooperative contract purchases audit that we did. There were 3 activities that were due December 15th, 2022. Dr. Villalba, from the Executive Director of Procurement and School Resources, requested an extension to January 31st. There's 5 activities left on this cap. That extension doesn't extend the entire cap. It just brings all those 5 activities to the January 31st due date. Dr. Villalba's here, and so is Ms. Aguirre. If you have any questions regarding this extension, I believe that these had to do with reports on vendor activity, that they were getting assistance from the ASAP department and IT to develop, that they would use as part of their monitoring for compliance with Board Policy CH.
I might add that we're also currently reviewing Policy CH local, because, and as a matter of fact, we just had a meeting last week so that we could look at systems and controls that may be currently not present, that we need to think about as we look at any adjustments or revisions to CH local. Because what I shared with the staff is I want the systems and controls in place prior to looking at any revision to the policy, so that once the policy is revised, should the board approve it, that we're ready to implement and execute, right? So.
I guess my general question on this is that I understand that you're reviewing the policy and I think it's needed, but more than anything, as this is getting extended to the end of this month, my worry is that the cap that we're gonna get out of this will be a Band-Aid, and it's not necessarily gonna be fixing a process. So how is that being developed as you go into the cap to make sure that there are systems and processes in place to not just do this because it's an annoying thing that we need to meet something or something else, right? I think it's just more, let's make it work better for everyone. So I kind of want to have your thoughts on that.
Absolutely.
Real quick, before he goes, I mean, that's kind of what I'm alluding to. For example, one of the system controls that we talked about that currently doesn't exist is being able to look at spending per vendor and being able to pull that report on a weekly basis so that we could give the board a monthly report on vendor spend, right? We currently don't have a system control in place to do that.
It's very manual. It's
Right.
very difficult.
So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about, that this, you know, with new leadership and the cap before us, we're looking beyond what the cap is requiring because we know that it's gonna have an impact on other systems and controls, right? So it's allowing us to kind of peel the onion and really find what systems and controls are absent. And it's also, kind of asking us to refocus on the CH local and figure out how any revisions might help the efficiency and productivity of the department.
I think what's important to note is this cap actually brought to light a couple of activities that we had to review, which primarily was the continuation of the bucket practice. And so 2 of these activities we essentially shut down by saying, as it stands now, we're not going to continue that practice. So the responses to the remaining items are going to be a bit modified. However, it's going to still address the main issue here. So having worked with ASAP and IT to start developing this dashboard and reporting mechanism, I think we're gonna get ourselves in a really better place to get to that reporting piece that we're discussing. So it's gonna be kind of a mixture of both.
Yeah, and I think my suggestion overall is, I mean, these buckets have been a headache for, what, 3 years now? I forget how long we have been working on this, but I think there's certain things, I always use the example of office supplies that makes sense to do buckets, but I think really aligning what we're doing with buckets and what we're not would be really helpful for us moving forward.
And that's why the policy revision is so important, because we're looking at, again, the systems and controls so that if there's anything that even appears to be similar to a bucket practice, that there's a justification and the reasons why that would fall in that category versus other practices, so. And really, the overall thing is to be transparent with the board, but transparent with the public, and to honor all of the procurement laws and everything that we're bound by in terms of Edgar and all of those things, so.
Yeah, procurement is one of those areas where you're like, you have a lot of requirements at the federal, state, level already. So it's a good opportunity to streamline the local processes and get buy-in from the board on how to streamline your process.
That's really it. Yeah, and I think it's really giving us the opportunity to find that magic mix of, yes, utilizing the co-ops when it's beneficial to the district, but then also taking the time to issue RFPs or solicitations as needed for specific needs of the district.
Okay. The final cap listed as having delays is an audit we had on contracted services for academics. Really, just one activity remains open, and that entails updating the progress measure language in the board goals that reference iStation. I know, Ms. Aveda, we had a conversation about that. The due date was November 30th. I know that you all have been working on updating all the priorities, and the House Bill 3 goals are just, go ahead.
Right, so I know that what's coming to the board in January, we've added an agenda item for the board to consider convening an ad hoc committee so that we can revise the House Bill 3 student outcome goals prior, which were named board goals in our prior, life. And so that's coming to the board. So once that ad hoc committee is pulled together, then we've scheduled meetings in late January and early February with the intent to bring the revised House Bill 3 student outcome goals to the board for approval in February.
And I think Ms. Saavedra, your recommendation was gonna be that as far as for measuring, that a vendor probably would not be
Yeah.
referenced, that it would be, like a different language, but, we can work, we've scheduled a meeting with Maybel and with Christine.
Yep.
I know they've kind of been taking the lead with that, so that we can fill out the extension form to probably April maybe, just to be sure that, I know you said probably March.
We're bringing it in February, you
Okay.
know, unless the board has any heartburn on, you know, because we're making progress on the goals that the way that they're written, but there are specific revisions that the administration is gonna recommend to the ad hoc committee. The board members on the ad hoc committee will provide feedback for us to finalize those. And then in the February board meeting, we'll update the board on the work of the committee and, you know, bring that to the board for consideration and approval. Because they're in a good place. But there are additional revisions that we're recommending aside from just removing the reference to specific vendor language in the outcome goals, so.
So we'll work with your team on that so we can get the plan.
Ms. Saavedra, if you needed somebody for that ad hoc committee, I'll be part of that.
Well, those will be the discussions at the January board meeting, because the board will determine or approve the development of an ad hoc committee, and then the board president will take, you know, interest and then, you know, appoint board members to the ad hoc committee. So certainly, but again, that'll be discussed in the January board meeting.
Okay, thank you.
But we got a plan to get that reconciled and complete.
Okay, great. So the next slide, are there any questions with cap extensions or delays?
I agree. I'd like to see it for April, if you an extension, just so that if there is discussion with what the ad hoc committee comes, and then the staff presents it, and I think historically we see that this board goes about 2 or 3 revisions before approvals, so that we can not have to do another extension after the fact,
So
so
we'll just put enough time to,
Yeah.
just to make sure that, okay.
that would be great, thank you.
The next section of the report covers staffing, just for disclosure, just how many hours that we've lost. But as you recall, in November, I did come to the board and adjust our potential hours lost due to vacancies and leave, and we're still under that number. I think we had budgeted for over 596 estimated hours of potential leave. So I think we're still in a good place as far as having the resources to carry out our plan. And then the last section of the report is on the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. Through December 12th, 2022, we had received a total of 68 reports for 26 different locations, and 97% of those were anonymous. We've been able to close 52 or 76% of those reports, and only in 2 cases, or 4%, was the concern substantiated. And then here you can see they've been summarized by category as well as location type. Most of the reports are in the employee relations category, and by location you'll see it's mostly from, in this instance, secondary schools have received the most reports. I just want to provide an update also to the committee that I've been working with the community engagement department on updating the fraud, waste, and abuse website. It's pretty old and it has a lot of writing in there, so they are kind of helping make it, you know, look, I guess, more user friendly, but as well as helping users, you know, navigate and try to encourage them to submit reports the proper way. This is just, it hasn't gone live, but this is kind of where they are, what they expect for it to look like. It gives you drop down menus if you really want more information, but as far as submitting the report itself, once you select that you want to make a report, it'll ask you what type of report you want to make. Note that here we've included fraud, waste, and abuse, which are the main categories, but we've also included other categories because what we would like is if they select one of the categories that is not something you typically provide, we want to be able to give them the guidance on where to go. So for example, harassment, that's not something they should be reporting through the hotline, but we are asking them to go to policy DIA local, and then there's a link to that policy where they can report. And then this screen also provides a reminder of this is what you should report through the hotline, and these are the things that you should not be reporting through the hotline. And then if they do select one of these categories like fraud, waste, abuse, conflict of interest, etc., then at that point they will be routed to our third-party administrator for the hotline NAVIX so that they can make the report. When they go to NAVIX, we've also worked with that vendor to make sure that we've also update the categories there as well. So they will not have the ability to report. They will have to select one of those categories, such as fraud, waste, abuse, conflicts of interest, abuse of power, etc. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question on the things what not to report, like the bullying, the discrimination and all that. So if they click on there, is there any way to route those, like, for example, to K-12 Insight? Where that's where we would want that information to actually go? Or would it route them to the correct reportable avenue for them rather than continuing to collect the report via this venue?
So it will not collect the report. It'll send them to the, as it is, as they've designed. We do have a link for the bullying, for student bullying. We have links for policy.
Okay.
What we can do is provide a link to K-12 if you'd like. That's another option we can do. We can do that for certain categories. I can work with Liza to see which ones make sense. I just don't want to go from bombarding the hotline
Yes,
to
yes, yes, yes.
K-12. But maybe for some of those, we can,
But K-12 is set up as a customer service product, if you will, so that if reports come in, it's routed to specific administrators that can provide an adequate response.
Okay.
Timely. So, yeah, I mean, I really like the fact that you all have proactively really tried to, capture what should be captured via this hotline and then develop a mechanism to route the community to where they can get their concerns
Right.
addressed.
And that's what we want. We want this to be not just, we're not going to respond, but we want to also educate them through, links to policy or other resources like the bullying app, or in this case, we can also see how we can include the K-12 app for them to be able to still report their concerns through the right process, not just through the hotline where that's not the intent of the hotline. So I just want to give you status on that. I'll check in with community engagement again this month to kind of see where they're at and see when we're ready to go live with the updates. And that's all I have for this presentation. Are there any questions? Okay, I have one final item on the agenda. And that is on Board Policy CFC Local and Exhibit, which is our internal audit charter. I typically report this to you all in April of every year to cover the policy and the internal audit charter. However, as we're going through internal meetings with leadership and legal, we are, the TASB Comprehensive Policy Review didn't include Board Policy CFC. It hasn't been updated since January 4th, 2017. It doesn't mean that updates are needed. However, I think it's a good opportunity to revisit the policy with the board and see if there's any opportunities for changes to the policy. The internal audit charter, I'm not recommending any changes. However, I know that the Institute of Internal Auditors is making updates to our professional standards, and those will probably be released this year. And at that point, we can revisit the charter. But I wanted to let you know that during my one-on-one meetings with board members, I'll be reviewing the policy just to see if there's any language changes you feel are needed to be made to CFC local. Keep in mind that the majority is on internal audit, but there's about a paragraph, maybe less than 2 paragraphs related to the external auditors as well. If you all have any feedback, I'll communicate those to Ms. Collins to see if it needs to come back for further review with the full board or how we can go about any changes that any board members may be suggesting. So I provided copies of the policy itself, and I've also summarized based on the sections. So for CFC local, it has a section on the annual external audit, the requirement for the audit itself, that it must be conducted by CPA, that it's in accordance with the standards, government auditing standards, as well as the FAST Financial Accountability System Resource Guide. that the board will select the external auditor for 1 year period with an option to renew 3 years, and that it should be through an RFQ. And then as far as the chief internal auditor, it outlines the selection, the board authority for selection. The board determines the job description. The chief internal auditor is required to have a certification, CIA or the CGAP, the requirement for yearly evaluation, and then that the department follow the professional standards from the Institute of Internal Auditors. The reporting that's required to meet that the reporting I'm required to provide, the plan of work, which is our audit plan, and the charter that must come to the board and can only be approved or amended by the board. The expectation that the organization and assignment of personnel to the internal audit department, it reports to the chief internal auditor, and that also only the board can make changes to that. I'm going through it really fast. And then the audit charter itself, again, has the subsections that are outlined here. The charter, again, it's pretty much tied to our professional standards. So at this point, I'll cover it with the board. If there are any specific changes or requests from the board, we can review them and compare them to the professional standards, see if it makes sense. But again, I think these changes are gonna come later this year. But at least for now, I'll give you all just an overview of what it looks like, and if you have any suggestions, I'll bring them back to Ceci after I meet with you all. And that one was a really short one. I think that's it, unless y'all have any questions on the policy.
Ms. Martinez, when reviewing your packet for today, I did see that policy on the website, and it had a lot of markings in red. So I think that was what I saw, and I do
Policy?
remember. And so, are we gonna get a clean copy eventually, or by Tuesday, by next week? Because I do remember seeing it, and it was marked out, the policy for accounting. CFC, was it?
Let me see if I can, I didn't submit the marked up one unless let me see real quick.
There was two,
Yes.
the
there was
local
two.
and then the one above it. So I thought.
You wouldn't be speaking about one that was in a previous comprehensive policy review, would you?
Possibly, it was the one on the website.
Yeah, there is one on the
Yeah.
website, and so for instance, Ms. Martinez, if you look at where the previous comprehensive policy reviews, where they're located on the policy page, and if you go down and then you can look under the C policies, you can see that CFC was revised in a previous TASB policy review. But it's not in red, it's in black. So I'm not exactly sure if that's what you were seeing, but in the event, in case it is, that's there.
Yeah, and I think it didn't go through the most recent policy review, and I think that's why it was on the list of policies that need to be just in case we need to make any updates.
Right, so the reason it didn't go through the most current policy review is because when the district submits its survey as to which policies it may need to be updated, that was not one of them
Right.
that was included.
So, Ms. Isabel, to answer your question, when you look at the documents for this item, the clean policies are there, following the presentation, and they are clean and available for your review. When I do reach out to meet with you, I'll also email you the policies for
Okay.
our discussion.
Sounds good. Thank you.
And that's all I have, unless there are any other questions. Okay, then that's all I have for today's meeting.
So who's responsible for adjourning?
All right. Sorry. Thank you, Myra. Very informative as always, and you stayed to 59 minutes. So we will adjourn at 5 p.m. today.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.